you certainly can't poo-poo what Donald and Walter came up with. But some of the stuff, I mean, I have to raise an eyebrow on that one.
This is Bill Schnee. He's known as the engineer's engineer. He's won multiple Grammy and Emmy awards and has over 125 gold and platinum records to his name. Throughout the 70s and 80s, and still to this day, Bill is the guy responsible for giving so many great records the sound they needed. I got in touch with Bill because I made a video about the creative process behind Asia. He was the engineer on that album. Bill's approach to creating music is truly unique. Not only does he have a great technical knowledge, but he also has a deep understanding of music as an art form. I spoke with Bill to try and learn more about his process and to get his thoughts on music and the future of production. If you've read Bill's book, then you'll know that as well as all this knowledge and wisdom, he has some great stories to tell. So stick around to the end because there's so much to learn from Bill. I started by asking him how he first fell in love with producing music.
My parents moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles from when I was 16 for my senior year of high school. And in the new school, I met some guys that were starting a band, and I joined in with them. And we wrote some songs, played around as high school bands will do, and wrote some songs. And we got them to a guy that had just made a production deal with Decca Records. His name was Gary Usher. Gary was an interesting guy. He was friends with the Beach Boy family, the Wilson family, and he actually wanted to be a Beach Boy. And they didn't take him, but he did write two songs, two of their big hits, In My Room and 409 with Brian. So he had this production deal, and he thought we sent him 4 or 5 songs, and he thought one of them was a hit for sure. And he signed us up, and we recorded at Capitol and Western, 2 of the best studios at the time and still to this day. Well, in those days, you know, they put out a single or 2, and if you had a hit, you ran in and recorded 6 songs, whatever it took to fill out an album. And we didn't have a hit, so there was no L.A. Teens album. But in the process, our first night, Gary had brought in this very talented guitar player to augment the band, a guy named Richie Podler. And it turns out that Richie Podler was also, in addition to being an incredible guitar player, he was also an incredible engineer and ultimately producer. And he had built his own studio. So when we got dropped, I went over to his place and told him the sad story. And he said, "Oh, you guys were good. I can get you a record deal. Go see this guy, Mike Curb. He's going to go places." So we went to see Mike Curb, and he signed us up. And we went into Richie's studio to record a song. And his studio was a lot funkier than those really nice professional studios. And I didn't know anything about what made a good studio. But when I came in, we cut our first track, and when I came in for the playback, the sound that came out of the speakers did something to me emotionally that the other playbacks in the other great studios hadn't done. And I realized right then what a difference the sound could make. So much so that I turned to him right there and said, "Can you teach me what all this stuff does?" And he said, "No, I'm teaching Bill Cooper here. You go out and do another take. You know, let's get back to the music." But that was that, as you put it, aha moment where it set the course of my life.
This is the start of understanding what makes Bill so great as a producer. He sees music as an art form and tries to develop this emotional connection to it. But how does he do this considering he's often working for other artists?
I've always felt that both recording, engineering, and producing are servants' roles. I'm there to serve the artist and their music. So, you know, now since I'm there and being paid, you know, for my opinions on either one or both of those jobs, obviously I'm going to give them, but it's absolutely to serve them. And, you know, I think that when I start a song, approach a song, I'm trying, you know, usually the artist, depends on the artist. Some artists will have a definite feeling about what they want, how they want it. They don't know how to get it. Others haven't got a clue. So I always, especially as a producer, I always looked at it like a good painter. A good painter will come along in a house. If somebody buys an old house and they come in and he looks and here, this wall, well, it doesn't need it. It's been painted recently. It doesn't need anything. And he goes in the next room and, oh, there's some this could use a coat of paint, so he'll primer it and paint it. He goes into the next room and there's like holes in the wall. So now he has to fill the holes and then do the priming and the painting. Well, sort of like that. You do whatever is necessary. If you know, and that's a creative decision on my part, a right brain decision, obviously. But if something that is very important is to, I think, is leave well enough alone. You know, is to know when something is good. You don't need to recreate the wheel.
One of the best ways of establishing this connection is trying to find something that uses your imagination. Something Bill and I have in common is our love of the Beach Boys. I love their music because it takes me away to another world. I asked Bill about the importance of imagery in music and how he uses his imagination.
First of all, I'm right with you. In fact, in the beginning, I was much more of a Beach Boys fan than a Beatles fan. that eventually turned around, sadly, because the Beach Boys didn't stay the Beach Boys when Brian kind of lost the number, unfortunately. But yeah, and he obviously was just absolutely brilliant, and especially with vocals. He was a big fan of a lot of those 4-part harmony groups that were right before his time, and he had managed to incorporate those into obviously a very contemporary setting in terms of both musically and especially lyrically, and his songs and the way he performed them were extremely visual. And I think there is an aspect of that some of the, that gets into the songwriting, starts with the songwriting, of course, and then goes on to how the production fleshes it out. But so much of imagery comes from lyrics, whether it's a love song, or an angst song, or whatever you're trying to communicate. So I'm with you on that for sure. The visual aspect of what it can be and and that's when it's really the best, I think.
So this gives us a bit of an idea about Bill's creative process. But what does his role actually look like in the studio? And what's he doing behind the desk to try and work towards this finished product?
When I started, my first session, when I had the aha moment and Richie wouldn't teach me, I went off to another studio, and it was kind of not a very well done studio, and it was only stereo. So that meant that every session was mixed live. That was the finished product, which was a great thing for me to learn on, because that to me is still the most important thing to me, is balancing the elements to get that, to deliver what the song is trying to say, hopefully on an emotional level. So when I started and got into starting with 8-track, 16, 24, 48, before there was any computer help for mixing, I mixed, I like to mix, as you say, for a performance, which means I started at the beginning and went straight through the song, being guided by the right brain. I had paper, little tapes on the individual faders that I had a mark where I got the static balance that I felt was good. But after that, it was up to me as to what was going to happen. And some things worked, some things might not. Then the next one, I'll do the ones that worked and try something in the spots that didn't work, that kind of thing. When we finally got, for me, it was probably around 1980 when we got computers to help us. That would be moving fader automation, that consoles would have faders that were connected to a computer that had motors in them, so that you moved the fader and it registered in the computer, and then when you played back the tape the next time, it moved the faders. When I finally got those and installed that in my studio, it took me a while to learn to let the computer help me, because it was messing with me. It was taking away from my ability to do the performance. So that was a big adjustment, which I was forced to make, because we got into so many tracks that you couldn't really do it. When we got to 48 tracks, that's just a little too much to handle, moving on the fly as the song goes down.
One of Bill's foundational principles is the understanding that it's necessary to keep up with changing technology. Perhaps this is why his career has lasted so long, and why he still loves producing music. But often new technology and artists don't work in perfect harmony, especially when the technology can become overpowering.
8-track to me is where the beginning of recording studios changed, because the sound of recording studios is being built. Because up to that point, studios were built for the ensemble in the room to sound good, and the balance was done, in great part by moving the instruments as well as the microphones to get them in the right place for a good sound. And when we went to 8-track, it was, the bill of goods was, well, we can put things on a separate track. And the great news about that is now when we come back, we can come back and, first of all, we can do overdubs a lot more easily. And now when we mix it, we can actually do a mix down, and we can even change the arrangement somewhat. So my example I always give is a producer gets honked into the 8-track, puts the drums on a track, the piano on a track, and so on, and then he comes to the mix, and the engineer says, well, what do you think of the mix? He sounds good, but what would it be like without drums in the intro? And he turns the drums off, and lo and behold, he says, but I still hear the cymbals. And the engineer goes, yeah, that's the spill into the piano. Oh, so we can't take the drums out of the intro. No, but I'll fix that next time. And that was the beginning of, blanketing the piano. And ultimately, from there, leakage became a bad word. The sound of one instrument getting in another instrument's microphone, you had to have control. So that's where the construction of studios that were dead began. And that's what I grew up in, by and large.
1980 was an interesting year for music technology, especially from Bill's perspective, because after Asia, Steely Dan started using a drum machine for their album Gaucho. For Bill, drums are one of the most important parts of the recording process. So I asked how this worked when recording Asia.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about Asia was when Gary Katz, the producer, called and asked if I wanted to do the next Steely Dan album, and I said, absolutely. He said, it's going to be a revolving door of drummers. They want to try all kinds of guys out on it. And so you'll be getting a new drum sound every few days. And I said, okay, that's no problem. And I don't think they ever tried the same song with more than one drummer. I think that, they had certain, whether they actually knew what they were, if they had pre-planned that, I don't know. But we did Black Cow once, and we never did it again with someone else. So, and obviously, I mean, one of my favorite things about drummers is how they feel. I'm a wannabe drummer. I'm a keyboard player at heart, but I'm a wannabe drummer, and I love drums and all that, and I love the way they feel. And that's, I said in my book, that's how the brain directs the 4 appendages that are going on in a drummer to play. And some people, their brains have them like a clock, and some, and they learn to do this. They can learn to do this. Perhaps their left hand on the snare is just a little bit late to the bass drum beats, and the hi-hat might just be kind of just a little bit in between both of those, that kind of thing. And that's what makes the feel of a drummer. And as you point out, drum machines they've worked really hard, and they've gotten a lot better, people making them and programming and whatnot to give them a sense of feel. But it's not the same as a human being, that's for sure.
By the time Gaucho came around, Donald and Walter were then using the drum machine Wendell to try and get that perfect sound. It gave them exactly what they wanted, but it also took away some of the human element of playing.
So they got definitely different feels on Asia with the different drummers. Then when they went to the next album, Gaucho, they were searching for the perfect drums, whatever that means. And I'll never forget one of my great friends, Jeff Porcaro, fabulous, unbelievable drummer that he was, came back from a week in New York to Los Angeles and popped in the studio one day, and I said, how did it go with Donald and Walter? And he said, it was grueling. He said, they had me 3 days I played the same song for 3 days with 3 different rhythm sections. And their theory was that I would play differently with different rhythm sections. And all they were trying was to get my drum track, and then they would go back in and record all the instruments to that drum track. And what can I say? Everybody's creativity works in the way it works. And you certainly can't poo-poo what Donald and Walter came up with. But some of the stuff, I mean, I have to raise an eyebrow on that one.
So why is it drums are so important, both for Bill and for Donald and Walter in this case? What is it exactly that they're searching for?
Well, I mean, if you stand 10, 15 feet in front of a drum set, it's pretty loud and brashy still, and yet if you mic'd it out there and tried to make a pop record, it's too distant, for the most part. So then it becomes mics on drums. And I figured out early on with regard to all kinds of things. The piano is the same thing. When does the piano sound right? Is it, out in the audience on a 10-foot grand or 8-foot grand out in the audience on a concert? Or what about on a pop thing? Maybe a couple of feet out, same thing. But yet everyone's putting mics in the piano. And so I realized early on that it's not about reality. It's not about reality. It's about whatever comes out of speakers that's going to be euphoric, that's going to feel good and sound good and that kind of thing.
Is this kind of philosophy that Bill has, which has kept so much of the artistry and humanity in the music that he's worked on? But technology has changed so much over the past few decades. So I wanted to get his thoughts on these changes and also how he saw things changing going forward.
Well, it's an often asked question, and the often provided answer is, I don't know, who knows, I mean, as I touched on earlier, the fact that we don't have as much of the record companies helping artists along is not necessarily a positive thing. There's no lack of creativity. I mean, I believe God gives gifts to people, and the people that he blesses with a musical gift, I don't think he's, hasn't given up or stopped or anything like that. It's just how do we go about getting it developed the best way possible? And which brings up another thing that is that from an engineering standpoint, one of the problems right now for me is that there is so much, let me rephrase that, there's too much information out there, and it's become too technical. By that I mean, you can go on YouTube and there are hundreds, maybe thousands of how-tos by different people. Or there's subscription services, even more, with masters that will show you how they do this and they do that. And that's all well and good, but some of it is very contradicting and kind of confusing, I would think. And the other thing about that is that it's gotten into because there is so much technology inside of a DAW, that one of my kind of gripes is that the kids are being concentrating. You're forced to concentrate on that, alluding to something you said much earlier. So concentrating on that instead of the name of the game, which is the musical balance, the music itself. If you're spending all your time thinking of all these things, within the framework of different aspects of Pro Tools, when are you going to have time to think about the music?
So maybe this is what's really important for younger musicians, trying to give them that aha moment that Bill had when he was younger. And this is what I hopefully try and do with this channel, which is to help people fall in love with music.
Undoubtedly, they listen to music, whether it's older music or current music, whatever, and they get a form of that aha moment where, wow, I wonder how they do that. And then the shift into getting into it, and that's when all of this technology can get in the way very, very easily. And I'm not exactly sure how to prevent that for young people. But
with this in mind, I asked Bill what he thought of the current state of the music industry and record labels as well.
The saddest part about the business being gone from whence it once was back then a business that had a product to sell, and now it makes a product that they lease, is that, of course, everything has changed with regard to the help that a record company can give an artist. The good news is anybody and everybody can start making records at a very early age. The bad news is that all artists need time to develop. And as I'm familiar as take two, I'm as familiar as anyone with the ills of the record business, but they provided a lot of positives and mentoring and helping artists along, giving them, for instance, a producer like the LA Teens had, a producer to help you and guide you, because you don't really, when you're starting out, you don't know that much about what you're doing. And so back in the day, you found that if a record company believed in an artist, they would do a second record or even a third record with them. They stuck with them. A band that I produced in the 70s, Pablo Cruz, they had done two albums when I did the third that didn't do that well. You would not say they were hit albums, but the record company believed in them, and then they changed producers to myself, but mostly the fact that I won't take all the credit. They sent me a song that I knew was a hit, What You're Gonna Do, and but it just shows that there was three three times. Today, record companies are signing many fewer artists, a small fraction.
And finally, what excites Bill about music today?
What excites me in music today? Bruno Mars. Yeah, I'm a huge Bruno fan, and why not? Because, old school R&B is probably my favorite genre. I like all music. I've been very, very fortunate to have success in all areas of music, all genres of music. But old school R&B is probably my favorite, and that's clearly what, he is the modern version of that. And Smooth Sonic, is that what it is? That one album is nothing but that. But yeah, there's no question that there's, I go looking for things to excite me, and they are there. They're definitely there. A little fewer and far between than maybe 30 years ago, but it's there, and undoubtedly, as things change, and they have, and they will continue to change. It always has. It'll be very interesting and fun to see where everything is going. I can still relate to everything, so that I can still keep working. In other words, if I couldn't relate to it, it'd be very hard for me to know how to integrate, how to offer my services.
Thank you so much to Bill for giving up his time and speaking with me, and for being so kind in answering so many questions. This video isn't sponsored or paid for by Bill, but he does have a book out, so if you enjoyed these stories and you'd like to learn more about his life and his process, I highly encourage you to check out his book. I'll put a link in the description.